My next two guests are experts on how we can make education much more inclusive. Lindsay Jones is the CEO of the education nonprofit CAST, which is working to improve inclusivity in the practice and design of education. She's also the former president and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And Rey Saldaña is the president and CEO of Communities in Schools, a national organization with a mission of keeping kids in school and on the path to a brighter future. Welcome to you both. Rey, I was just enjoying your Twitter feed and saw this cool thing from February with you with a selfie with Secretary Cardona. So, you know, there you go. We almost got you on the screen together again. But I'm interested to just start out about these questions. So I think part of the challenge we have today is thinking about this awful period the nation has gone through. And in that awful period, a lot of resources are coming in. So how do we basically take the wobbly parts of the system that weren't performing right and improve them? And so with all due respect, you know, I hear Communities in Schools, I know you're president, and you're actually a product, you're an alum of that. You know, there are elements that I find in my job. I run into these fascinating boutiques, these stories, these positive stories. And then when you kind of look for scale or data or what can we replicate, sometimes fall short. So tell us about Communities in Schools, and if you can make the case that what you've done there is something that might enhance or build or change educational opportunity elsewhere in the country.
Well, that's a really great question, and I will use a question that you asked of Secretary of Education, our Secretary of Ed, which is, what are we supposed to be obsessive about? I'll tell you what we are obsessive about here at Communities in Schools. It's how do we center building relationships? Because what we really, really care about is how do you get a student turned on to living? Because living is the hard part. Before you can get turned on to learning, the living piece needs to be set with the student and with the family. And I'll push a little bit and say that at one point we were probably boutique 20 years ago. At this point now we're in 3,000 schools. But we also see the vision of evidence-based wraparound student services, not just being what Communities in Schools can do to grow into every Title I school, which we're focused on. And these are students that are serving a majority of students who are living in poverty. It's that we actually get to see a definition that more schools, whether those are superintendents and policymakers, are obsessed about the same thing we are. Because if you're obsessed about learning loss, you have to ensure that a student is well fed, that they have access to quality, stable housing, that they have access to mental health supports. And so what we do is essentially, as a national nonprofit, work alongside our principals and our teachers, because let's do something that I would advise against with so much crisis happening in the world. Let's put ourselves in the mind of a superintendent. Currently, what they're solving for is not only learning loss, it's teacher shortage, it's bus shortages. It is a crisis at their door and just getting schools reopened. So the earthquake happened. The aftershock is what we need to be focused on in terms of redesigning a future with the elements of perhaps a budgeted a person who is actually on the school, coordinating the resources inside of the school. That's what we've been doing at Communities in Schools for 45 years. But really, I think that's the vision that many superintendents are saying, can I figure this out on our own? Are there outside agencies that can help do this? Because that really is the future of the movement and the building of the field of wraparound student services. So we're excited. We're in about half the country now, but we believe that this needs to be a component of public education if we're to envision one with equity and justice for those students who we're serving.
I will not be able to think about a superintendent in the way I did a few moments ago. So it's a fascinating depiction you did. I felt stress up and down my neck a moment ago. But Lindsay Jones, I'll ask you an equally tough question. I mean, you're interested in education, transforming education design. You also have a tilt, I see it in your Twitter feed, on how do we help children with learning disabilities, those people, and not just children, it's across the board. You know, how do we make sure that we have an inclusive picture and not one where people are just adjunct to what's going on, if you will. And I guess the question I have is, what are the barriers, you know, as you see it? And I'd love to hear your story, but what are the things that get in the way of actually coming out with something that just, where gravity works towards inclusion, where it becomes more natural and not so hard? I don't know if that's the right way to frame it, but that's what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a critical question for the future, and something that was so highlighted by the pandemic itself and what happened to education and all of us, all of our work world throughout it. The future has to be more flexible. There is not one type of learner. The world and what we know about learning science shows us that it's rich and complicated, and our education system has to be designed to maximize that. And so to do that, it has to be designed for variability. One way to do that is to look at people who currently now we would consider to be on the margins. So we'd be designing for them. What we've learned over time through almost everything is that when we design with accessibility in mind, with inclusion in mind, we end up helping everyone so much more. We make a system that's much more flexible for all of us. So many people will talk about the factory model of education. And I think as Rey has described it in such rich terms, the way we're looking to design in the future is one that helps educators help bring out the strengths and the talents of all students. And critically, I think it's mindsets. It's maybe unlearning a little bit about the way that we were taught toward this factory model. It's changing the mindset of what we are trying to measure and of what strengths individuals bring. I think a critical piece of information that we learned during the pandemic was that outside of education, many people using video conferencing were on Zoom, were live streaming, Teams as an example. More people across the globe used captioning during the pandemic than ever before. Most of those people didn't have a disability that required that, and yet found that really useful. So at CAST, what we're trying to do is work with educators in schools and work with adult learners in apprenticeship programs and other types of job training, youth build programs to make sure that we're designing flexibly and that educators, when they see barriers, are ready to respond to pull those barriers down.
Let me just ask you both really quickly, because we're already out of time again, but you know, the collaborative that's supporting today's conversation, I really mentioned the sponsor, but they deserve mentioning. They have a website called EDU Recovery Hub. So I went on. It's really, about, hey, let's learn what we can about this money, best practices, and let's look at data. And it's too early to tell, but a couple of things they had popping out, when you're watching, at least on my iPhone, was in Texas, where I think you are, Rey. They're giving 30 hours of accelerated instruction to low-performing students. In Nevada, they're giving, Lindsay, $5,000 grants for families that are suffering, who have childhood disabilities. I'm just interested in whether both of you, whether those resonate, but secondly, very quickly, do you see things we ought to be showing and telling? I love show and tell. Are there things and practices that we could learn from each of you that we ought to be putting in this program? We can't go in depth now, but what would be some of those items, right?
Yeah, well, as you did, I also got on the EDU Recovery Hub, and it is just a really great resource to identify with $180 billion out the door from federal support, with the kind of flexibility that we are seeing school leaders and principals and superintendents really go after this. They're putting some contours, which I think are really helpful. And I'm glad I'm on with Lindsay, because if anybody is testing the molds of an old system, it's the folks at CAST. But I also think our superintendents and our leaders are doing that at the same time, because they're thinking about what Senator Cassidy talked about. How do you implement mental health supports? How do you implement social emotional learning? But at the same time, how do you track for improvement with your students? And so we think there is, this is a war at play, speaking of crisis, but there is an army that you need to fight this inside our schools. And of course, as an organization, we've got about 4,000 staff alongside our principals. Let's not do this. Let's not make the mistake of layering more pressures on top of the existing staff that are already inside schools. But what I think is one particularly important feature of the pandemic, and I was just talking to students from Eastern Area High School, that is us getting into more living rooms and stairwells than we ever have in the past. And that's important for family engagement.
Thank you. Lindsay, last word.
I just agree that there are so many great resources on the Edu Recovery Hub, and we need those great ideas, because we are creating this system as we're living it. And I think, here at CAST, of course, we're focused on universal design for learning, which incorporates lots of those practices, but allows for our educators to be supported in shifting to a mindset that is flexible. And I couldn't agree more with what Rey said about we need everybody in every school on the ground thinking about and working on these problems.
Really a pleasure to talk to you both. It's inspiring to talk to people out working in education. I don't get to do it that much, and so I get very excited in these conversations. I really want to thank Lindsay Jones, CEO of CAST, and Rey Saldaña, President, CEO of Communities and Schools. Really, thank you so much for all you are doing and for talking with us today.
Thank you.